January 1944. Far out over the Central Pacific, the morning sky carried a pale silver glow as the first light touched the scattered cloud layers. The air was thin and sharp, and the distant horizon shimmered with the quiet promise of another long-range American bombing mission. From above, the ocean looked calm, almost gentle, but beneath that stillness lay the tension of a war accelerating into its most unforgiving phase. On that morning, a lone B-17, patched from earlier missions and bearing an unusual paint pattern across its fuselage, drifted in formation like a strange animal hidden among giants. Its skin, striped in an odd pattern of dark strokes, looked nothing like the polished aluminum of the bombers around it. It was a sight that had already confused American ground crews and stirred laughter among enemy pilots who spotted it from a distance. But for those inside the aircraft, especially the mechanic-turned-crewmen who had painted those stripes, the marking symbolized something far deeper. Survival improvised out of desperation. The Pacific Air War was not a place for experiments or eccentric decoration. Every inch of the bomber was meant for function, not aesthetics. Yet the stripes, dark, uneven, at times almost primitive, stood out in stark contrast to the machinery of war. They clung to the fuselage like scars or warnings, and in a few hours, they would become something more, a symbol of unpredictability, of American adaptability, and of the ability to bend the war's narrative through ingenuity rather than sheer force. That morning, the bomber and its crew prepared for another mission northward, across waters contested by Japanese naval aviation. What they did not know was that this flight would become part of the story whispered across units, carried through veteran recollections, and quietly documented in wartime memoirs. The Japanese pilots who first noticed the striped aircraft had reacted initially with amusement. Allied bombers usually appeared in tight, disciplined formations, each painted in predictable olive drab or bare metal. But the Tiger Stripe B-17 seemed almost playful, an oddity in the violent choreography of air combat. Reports later describe how certain Japanese aviators mistook it for a damaged aircraft with hastily applied repairs, something improvised and unprofessional. They expected an easy target, the kind that could be isolated, then torn apart with coordinated bursts of 20mm cannon fire. But what they encountered that day, and again in the weeks that followed, forced a reassessment of their assumptions, reshaping their understanding of American air power in ways no manual or briefing had prepared them for. The historical backdrop of that moment was critical. By early 1944, Japan's frontline aviation had suffered severe attrition. Veteran pilots, once considered the finest in the Pacific, were now spread thin across distant bases, flying outdated machines or struggling to maintain performance due to fuel shortages and mechanical wear. The American, by contrast, were escalating both technologically and numerically. The B-17, though aging as new B-29s entered service, remained a symbol of resilience. It flew through storms, graduated from mission after mission, and carried the memories of countless battles across its metal frame. But even a symbol sometimes needed an edge, a new angle, a form of unpredictability. The stripes, initially brushed onto bomber's surface during a maintenance delay, had unintentionally provided such an edge. The mechanic responsible had intended simply to disrupt the aircraft's silhouette from certain angles, mimicking the principle of naval dazzle camouflage. It was not officially sanctioned, nor was it refined. It did not resemble the crisp, geometric patterns used on warships earlier in the conflict. Instead, it looked wild, instinctive, almost instinctual, as if mirroring the raw survival instincts that defined the air war. And in the open skies, where distances compressed and expanded in an instant, those stripes altered perception. Japanese pilots reported moments of hesitation during approach, misjudging angles or distance, often believing the aircraft was angled differently than it truly was. In air combat, a moment of hesitation was enough. The recurring sound that defined the experience around the Strike B-17 was the rhythm of its engines. The deep, pulsing roar of the Wright Cyclone engines that had carried thousands of crewmen across war zones from the Solomons to the Marianas. That engine note symbolized American endurance. It was a heartbeat of long-range bombing doctrine, the echo of industrial strength projecting itself across thousands of miles. And that sound, steady, resonant, and unwavering, became a symbolic thread connecting every stage of this particular story, a reminder that American power was not merely technological but logistical, grounded in the ability to produce and maintain machinery that outlasted and outperformed its opponents. As the bomber climbed toward cruising altitude, its striped skin shimmering oddly beneath the rising sun, the crew inside prepared with quiet concentration. They checked ammunition belts, oxygen lines, and turret bearings. They listened to the engines with trained instincts, feeling for vibration patterns that signaled trouble. They had flown missions where the sky itself felt hostile, filled with flak bursts, enemy fighters, and a heavy knowledge that not all aircraft returned home. Yet on this aircraft, there was something different. The stripes seemed to carry a psychological effect as well. They had become a talisman of sorts, a reminder that survival sometimes depended not only on official training or doctrine, but on the willingness to innovate in unexpected ways. The first sighting of Japanese fighters that morning came as dark specks on the edge of the clouds. The enemy approached fast, closing distance with the confidence of pilots who believed they had spotted weakness. Later records from U.S. intelligence summaries noted that certain Japanese units had remarked specifically on the unusual painted bomber, assuming it to be isolated. But what unfolded contradicted those expectations. The attacks came from angles that played directly into the illusion created by the stripes. Gunner reports mention confused approach patterns, sudden corrections by enemy fighters, and firing arcs that missed by margins far larger than usual. One Japanese aviator, whose logbook entry survived the war, described the encounter as strangely disorienting, noting that the bomber's outline shifted when viewed against cloud cover. This was not magic, nor was it a miracle. It was physics and perception, an accidental innovation that played into the visual limitations of high-speed aerial combat. The stripes broke the bomber silhouette just enough to disrupt precise targeting during the most critical seconds of an attack run. Combined with disciplined defensive fire and coordinated formation maneuvering, the Strike B-17 gained a reputation among nearby units as unusually difficult to hit. What had begun as a mechanic's improvised idea was evolving into battlefield lore, reinforced by multiple documented encounters where the aircraft returned with fewer bullet holes than expected or survived attacks that crippled unmodified bombers. The symbolism of the stripes deepened as the missions continued. They represented the capacity of American forces to adapt under pressure, to transform even the simplest idea into an operational advantage. They symbolized creativity under fire, a trait often underestimated by enemy command structures that valued rigid doctrine over improvisation. And above all, they became a reminder that the war was as much a contest of innovation as it was of firepower. The Japanese pilots who once laughed at the aircraft's appearance were beginning to view it differently, though the full transformation perception was still unfolding. The next missions would cement that shift, turning ridicule into caution, then caution into something closer to respect, an acknowledgement that the Americans were capable of reshaping the battlefield in ways both unexpected and deeply effective. The transformation in perception did not occur overnight, nor did it result from a single engagement. It grew gradually, shaped by reports, mission logs, and quiet exchanges among pilots who returned from sorties with a sense of unease they could not fully articulate. In the early months of 1944, as American air operations intensified across the Pacific, Japanese fighter units encountered more and more B-17s moving across vast distances, carrying out reconnaissance, bombing runs, and long-range harassment operations. But amid the routine chaos of the air war, the Strike B-17 stood out. Its reputation reinforced each time it returned home, bearing fewer wounds than expected or outperforming predictions in engagements where the odds had tilted dangerously against it. War tended to magnify patterns, even accidental ones. A single aircraft that repeatedly endures fire, escapes traps, and returns intact begins to accumulate a mythic aura. Crewmen start to speak of luck, providence, or strange advantages. Air intelligence officers examine the data, try to determine whether performance differences can be explained by flight altitude, gunnery discipline, or weather. But in this case, the pattern evaded easy explanation. The stripes were technically not sanctioned camouflage, nor did they match any officially studied designs. They were rough, uneven, and improvised. Yet, according to damage reports later consolidated into U.S. Army Air Force's records, The striped B-17 showed a notably lower hit probability across specific attack angles compared to other aircraft in its group. The deeper truth was rooted in perception and speed. Air combat in the Pacific was violent and fast, often decided in seconds. Pilots closed in, fired, and banked away in rapid cycles, relying on split-second judgment and experience. A disruptive visual pattern could distort the perceived orientation or angle of the target during these critical seconds. The stripes, curving at imperfect intervals, created false contours that interfere with the instinctive visual calculations Japanese pilots relied on. When combined with turbulence, glare, cloud shadows, and the stress of anti-aircraft fire from the bombers' defensive positions, the effect became significant enough to impact the outcome of multiple encounters. The recurring symbol of this story, the deep, steady thrum of the B-17's engines, continued to echo through every mission the striped bomber flew. It was a sound that reassured the crew that the aircraft, aged though it was, still held together. That sound represented endurance, an American industrial heartbeat pulsing through metal, fuel, and sky. In contrast, many Japanese fighters by early 1944 struggled with mechanical reliability, worn engines, and maintenance shortages. As the war dragged on, the disparity became glaring. American machines grew more numerous and more refined, while many Japanese units were forced to operate under increasingly restricted conditions, conserving fuel and improvising repairs. Against this backdrop, the striped B-17 cut a strange path across the sky. The more encounters it survived, the more its legend grew, carrying with it layers of symbolism that transcended the original intent of mechanics' brushstrokes. For American aircrews, the stripes became an emblem of innovation under pressure, a visual reminder that the United States consistently adapted, refined, and reimagined its approach to warfare. For Japanese pilots, the stripes slowly took on a different meaning. They became a warning, a subtle signal that the target ahead was not what it appeared to be. The shift in attitude first appeared in fragmented mission notes. Japanese pilots who had once described the aircraft in dismissive terms now used phrases suggesting caution. Observers on the ground reported that aviators returning from failed intercept attempts referenced the striped bomber in tones of frustration rather than mockery. Even in the absence of explicit documentation, the pattern was unmistakable. What had once been a source of laughter was becoming a tactical concern. The emotional contrast reached its peak during a mission deep into contested airspace, when the striped B-17 found itself momentarily separated from its formation due to cloud disruption. Normally, isolation spelled danger. A lone bomber in the Pacific was a vulnerable target, a heavy, less maneuverable aircraft that risked being overwhelmed by coordinated fighter attacks. But on that day, as the bomber emerged from the clouds into open sky, the first Japanese fighters to spot it hesitated just long enough for the rest of the formation to reappear. That hesitation, small, instinctive, and fleeting, was a direct result of the visual distortion created by the stripes. In combat, hesitation often separated survival from destruction. American after-action analysis later noted that this temporary disorientation among enemy fighters allowed the group to re-establish cohesion far more quickly than anticipated. In such moments, the stripes were not merely camouflage. They became the thin margin between disaster and escape. This event marked a quiet internal shift among those who studied mission survivability. Though official doctrine remained unchanged, veteran crews spoke increasingly the striped B-17 with a tone of respect, not amusement. They recognized that its odd appearance had played a role, however small, in maintaining the fragile balance between life and death in the open skies. In Japan, the growing respect for American adaptability was mirrored in other theaters, where reports of unconventional Allied tactics had already begun reshaping strategic thinking. The war had revealed that American forces often solved problems with ingenuity rather than rigidity, transforming minor ideas into meaningful advantages. Whether it was the use of radar-guided interception, creative logistical strategies, or the engineering of floating harbors during major operations, the pattern remained consistent. The striped bomber became one more example of this spirit, a reminder that the U.S. could weaponize even creativity. As missions continued and the bomber's reputation solidified, the mechanic who had originally painted the stripes became a quiet figure of interest among maintenance crews. He had not intended to create an icon. He simply wanted to give a vulnerable aircraft a fighting chance. Yet his work resonated far beyond the walls of the hangar. His stripes reflected a broader truth about the American war effort. It was powered not only by industrial scale, but by individual initiative, the willingness of ordinary servicemen to think differently, to experiment, and to push the boundaries of conventional practice. The engine note remained constant through it all, the low, powerful rumble that marked the presence of American air power across the Pacific. It was a sound Japanese soldiers came to recognize with unease, especially as the tide of the war turned. That sound signaled approaching bombers, advancing fleets, and the growing momentum of a conflict shifting irrevocably toward Allied victory. And for the crews of the striped B-17, it was a sound that anchored them through fear, fatigue, and uncertainty. It was their constant companion, the one element of their world that remained stable amid the volatility of air combat. By the time the bomber completed its 15th mission with the Stripes, the story had spread through multiple units, supported by data and personal testimony. The Japanese pilots who had laughed so freely at the aircraft's appearance no longer dismissed it. Instead, they spoke of it with a mixture of irritation and caution, an acknowledgement that the Americans had turned an odd idea into an unexpected tactical asset. The transformation was not merely about camouflage. It was about perception, how initial ridicule could shift into reluctant respect when confronted with evidence. It reflected the larger dynamics of the war itself. Early underestimations giving way to the realization that the United States possessed a depth of resilience and creativity that many had not anticipated. The striped bomber, with its uneven lines and improvised design, became a symbol of that lesson. And for those who flew inside it, who trusted their lives to its engines and metal frame, the stripes were not a joke or an accident. They were a statement, an emblem of survival in a war where survival depended on far more than firepower. The first time the Japanese air groups encountered DeWitt's B-17 in full daylight, they expected a formality, the kind of swift, confident interception they had practiced for months. The lead pilot of the attacking formation saw the striped aircraft from more than 5 miles away, its strange geometry impossible to miss against the cool shimmer of the Pacific morning. The men behind him assumed it would behave like every B-17 before it, predictable, slow to turn, hesitant under fire. Yet the more they closed the distance, the more they realized something was off. The bomber was no longer a wide, monotonous slab of metal. The alternating white and black lines warped its outline, bending the eye, forcing each approaching pilot to recalculate angles in real time. Their own discipline, the prized precision of naval aviators trained to see through chaos, began to strain under the illusion. The confusion only grew when they reached firing range. DeWitt held the formation steady, letting the stripe pattern do its quiet work. The same disciplined men who once laughed at the paint job now misjudged their approach speed by fractions of a second, but those fractions mattered. The first zero overcorrected and slid too far to the right. Another drifted just below a machine gun arc that ordinarily would have missed, but now caught him cleanly. Gunners inside the B-17, boosted by the knowledge that they were no longer operating in an entirely predictable machine, opened fire with steady rhythm. The tracers carved long, bright threads through the sky. For the Japanese pilots, those tracers seemed to erupt from impossible angles, a visual contradiction produced by the warped silhouette around them. Each burst of gunfire snapped like a metallic heartbeat, steady and undeniable, a harsh counterpoint to the eerily soft hum of the Zero engines weaving around them. For years, Japanese doctrine revolved around maneuverability, tight turns, and rapid vertical climbs. Those strengths depended on clarity, visual certainty of an enemy's position, speed, and angle. But as the striped bomber absorbed their attention, that clarity dissolved. The pattern made the defensive positions seem to shift even when they didn't. A pilot tracking the tail guns felt as if the tail narrowed and stretched by inches at random. Another, lining up a side approach, saw the fuselage appear slightly angled, as though turning would remain perfectly level. These distortions created seconds of hesitation. But a second in aerial combat was the difference between attack and retreat, between a burst of fire delivered cleanly and a burst wasted into empty space. DeWitt's crew sensed a shift as well. They felt confident but not reckless, aware that their aircraft was still heavy, still vulnerable, still dependent on discipline and coordination. Yet they also recognized something new, the sense that the enemy had lost its usual calm efficiency. The gunners tracked targets with sharper accuracy. The pilot maintained a steady bearing, his hands firm on the controls, trusting that every movement must be predictable to his own crew even as it became unpredictable to the enemy. In the radio compartment, the hum of equipment merged with the rhythmic rattle of guns until the sounds blended into a unified mechanical pulse, the pulse of an aircraft discovering its advantage in the simplest change of paint. The Japanese pilots attempted to regain discipline. They widened their pattern, regrouped, shifted altitude, and tried a fresh angle of attack. But each new run ended with the same discomforting realization. The stripes broke depth perception repeatedly. An approach meant to be 400 meters felt like 500. A climb meant to clear the bomber's belly turret by mere feet, instead drifted too wide. They knew the bomber should behave like all the others they had fought, yet it didn't feel like those machines. Something in its presence, its lines, its deceptive geometry, disrupted the muscle memory they depended on. What had begun as a tactical novelty now grew into a psychological one. The men in the Zeros were taught to anticipate fear in the enemy. They were not taught to anticipate doubt in themselves. But doubt was the quiet force slipping into their formation now. As the B-17 held its course, its engines thundering with slow, sovereign confidence, the pilots circling it struggled with a simple but corrosive question. Why does this one feel different? That question mattered more than bullets. In the chaos of a turning battle, the first pilot to question his instincts was also the first to break formation, the first to pull away prematurely, the first to lose the rhythm that kept coordinated attacks effective. DeWitt's bomber needed no unusual maneuver. It only needed to stay steady. The stripes did the rest. Minutes stretched. Attempts were made. Angles were tested. But each approach ended with the same pattern. Japanese pilots aborting an attack too early, or holding it too long, or slipping a hair off target, or firing a fraction too late. Small failures compounded. A squadron known for surgical precision now fought as though navigating through veils of distortion. The irony was unavoidable. A paint scheme once mocked as foolish now made some of the most disciplined aviators in the world feel clumsy. At last, the Japanese formation drifted back, creating distance as they reassessed the bomber. They circled warily at the edge of visual range. The sky was wide, but the moment felt strangely confined. DeWitt's aircraft hung in the center like a calm, deliberate machine refusing to budge. It did not dive. It did not flee. It simply existed boldly, stubbornly, wrapped in the strange geometry that rewrote the rules of approach. The guns remained ready but quiet, their barrels still smoking faintly from the last engagement. Inside the bomber, the crew exhaled slowly, aware they had just lived through something rare, a moment in which innovation had defeated instinct. As the Japanese pilots regrouped far above, they shared the same unsettling conclusion. This was no ordinary bomber, and if it looked different, moved different, and forced them to think different, then the normal odds no longer applied. The stripes had erased certainty, and a warrior who hesitates even once is no longer fighting with the same edge. The sky, moments before filled with fire and movement, now felt strangely suspended, as though waiting for the next chapter of an unexpected transformation. When the Japanese formation finally withdrew to a safer altitude, DeWitt's crew did not celebrate. They understood that an enemy falling back did not guarantee safety. It meant reassessment, recalculation, a fresh wave coming with new intent. The sky, still trembling faintly from the echoes of machine gun bursts, felt unnaturally quiet. Beneath the thin haze, sunlight struck the tiger-striped fuselage, creating a strange shimmer along the curves of the bomber. To the crew, those stripes were no longer just paint. They were a shield, improvised, unexpected, and now undeniably effective. The next phase of the confrontation came not through attack, but through observation. From above, Japanese pilots studied the strange aircraft with disciplined focus. Their flight leader, a veteran of dozens of engagements against American bombers, examined the distortions the stripes created. He noticed how the shadowed areas of the fuselage blended into the bright lines, how the engines appeared slightly misaligned at a distance, how the tail seemed to bend subtlety under certain angles. The more he analyzed, the more he understood the challenge. Their own optical certainty, the fundamental tool of their combat doctrine, was now compromised. A simple coat of paint had undone years of visual training. But a deeper issue lurked beneath the surface: pride. Japanese pilots were conditioned to adapt swiftly, to overcome obstacles without hesitation, and to treat momentary confusion as an insult to their discipline. Retreating without a clean strike gnawed at their sense of duty. They saw the B-17 not just as a target that escaped the first run, but as a question, a challenge to their mastery. So they prepared another approach. Below, DeWitt monitored the enemy shifting into position. The crew spread out in their stations, adjusting ammunition belts, scanning both sunlit sky and distant sea. The bomber remained steady, its engines humming with mechanical resolve. Even the sound of those engines, deep, constant, unwavering, became its own symbol aboard the aircraft, a reminder of abundance, of American industry humming thousands of miles away, building more machines, more ammunition, more hope. The Japanese cherished precision. America wielded production, and the rumble of those engines echoed that difference with every passing second. From altitude, the Japanese tightened their formation and began a coordinated dive. This time they approached with greater caution, adjusting their lines of sight more deliberately. But caution was its own disadvantage. While discipline gave them control, overthinking pulled them out of instinct, and instinct was what they needed most to counter an unfamiliar threat. As the Zeros descended, the striped B-17 again twisted their perception. The bomber, though flying straight, seemed to slide laterally. The alternating pattern gave the illusion of movement where none existed, as if the aircraft were shifting slightly left even as it held perfectly true. The Japanese pilots attempted to compensate, but every adjustment felt like a guess made half a second too late. At 800 meters, the first Zero opened fire. His rounds missed wide, streaking harmlessly past the left wing. A second Zero corrected too aggressively, dipping beneath the fuselage, directly into the guns of the ball turret. The gunner inside, sweat running down his temple, fired a controlled burst. The tracer stitched across the Zero's canopy. The aircraft veered off, trailing smoke, disappearing into the haze below. The remaining Japanese pilots pressed forward, but the pattern only continued. The B-17's gunners needed no luck. The enemy delivered themselves into lines of fire through their own miscalculations. Each strike the bomber delivered was less a demonstration of raw power and more a demonstration of how disorientation corrodes even the finest trained warriors. Inside the Japanese formation, frustration hardened into a grim realization. This bomber could not be engaged like the others. Every pass ended with losses or wasted ammunition. Every maneuver felt like trying to strike a shadow. Discipline began to fracture. One pilot aborted his run too early, pulling away with a sharp climb. Another hesitated at the last second, drifting wide. Unable to commit, a third attempted a direct belly attack, but misjudged the angle, nearly colliding with a wingman. Formation became chaos. Not through fear, but through uncertainty, the most silent and devastating force a pilot could face. Below, DeWitt's crew kept firing in measured bursts. No shouting, no panic, just a steady rhythm of trained men who understood their advantage and protected it with calm determination. The gunners, once accustomed to watching Zeros slice confidently through the sky, now watched those same aircraft move with hesitant, fractured motion. The second Japanese withdrawal came not by order, but by necessity. The attackers regrouped several miles east, their formation loose, their confidence cracked. Pilots exchanged brief, clipped observations. None spoke of retreat, yet all understood it. Some reported seeing the bomber shift strangely under sunlight. Others described the stripes as interfering with approach angles. One even suggested the aircraft might be turning subtly throughout the engagement, a misperception caused entirely by the paint scheme. The phenomenon became an unspoken truth. The American bomber had become visually untouchable. As DeWitt's crew watched the distant formation drift farther away, they felt something shift within themselves too. Not arrogance, never that, but a growing sense of transformation. They were flying the same machine they always had, yet the world around them now underestimated it. That underestimation was power. For the Japanese, the opposite transformation quietly took root. the recognition that even a small American innovation could alter the balance of combat. And if pain could break their discipline, what would come next? The stripes fluttered faintly in the wind, casting thin shadows across the fuselage, a strange, symbolic reminder that ideas, not weapons alone, reshaped the course of war. For nearly 10 minutes, the sky remained still. The B-17 held its course, engines thundering with the same dependable force that carried countless American aircraft across the Pacific. Inside the bomber, the crew moved with deliberate calm, checking ammunition drums, scanning their arcs, listening to steady vibration that reminded them of the machine's relentless endurance. It was in that moment of stillness that the symbolism of those engines became unmistakable. The sound of American abundance, the roar of a nation capable of replacing every bullet fired, every aircraft lost, every hour spent in combat. For the Japanese pilots, raised in an environment defined by scarcity and rationing, that abundance was almost incomprehensible, but the silence was only temporary. Far ahead the bomber's nose, faint glimmers stirred in the high atmosphere. The Japanese formation had returned, reorganized, determined not to let confusion dictate the outcome of the encounter. Yet the nature of their approach was different now. Their once confident arcs had flattened. Their dive patterns were less aggressive. Their spacing, once razor precise, now carried the telltale looseness of pilots haunted by uncertainty. The final engagement began with no flourish, no dramatic dive. Instead, the Japanese pilots attempted a more distant, calculated approach, a method rarely effective against a heavily armed B-17, but one that offered them relief from the visual disorientation. They fired from farther out, hoping saturation might crack the bomber's defenses. But long-distance bursts scattered uselessly across the sky, falling short, drifting wide, or striking only the empty horizon. What the Japanese could not see from their distance was how every tracer that missed the bomber strengthened the B-17's confidence. The gunners recognized the shift instantly. The enemy was no longer attacking with conviction. They were probing, testing, searching for a stable point of focus amid the tiger-striped illusion. Slowly, pass by pass, their rhythm broke. The Japanese pilots advanced again, but the distortion remained. Where the stripes reflected sunlight, the fuselage seemed to arc slightly. Where shadows fell, the tail appeared to bend. The bomber's outline, normally clear and geometric, behaved like a mirage. No amount of training compensated for that. These men have been taught to read silhouettes, to trust instinct, to strike with precision and confidence. Yet instinct faltered when vision itself became unreliable. 1-0 attempted a frontal approach. He aimed between the engines, but the alternating pattern stretched the distance, tricking him into firing too late. The bullet streaked beneath the bomber's belly, vanishing harmlessly into open sky. DeWitt's top turret answered with a single controlled burst. The tracer struck one wing root, forcing the Zero into a sharp roll. It spiraled away, trailing smoke, disappearing beneath a bank of clouds. Another pilot swung wide for a deflection attack, but again the stripes played their quiet trick. Believing the bomber's wing had tilted, he overcorrected, missing his angle entirely. The B-17's waist guns opened fire. Their shots clipped the edge of the Zero's tail fin, shredding fabric and forcing a retreat. With every failed run, Japanese confidence thinned further. Precision, the foundation of their combat doctrine, had become unreliable, and unpredictability, even in small degrees, corrodes discipline faster than any bullet. It was then that the Japanese flight leader recognized the true danger. Not the bomber's guns, not the crew, not even the aircraft itself. The danger was the illusion, the way a simple pattern bent perception, fractured certainty, and turned skilled warriors into unsure combatants. He signaled the end of the engagement. The formation peeled away, not in panic, but in realization. They had spent ammunition, risked aircraft, and lost men to a machine that now rewrote their assumptions. The pilots climbed into the sun, leaving the striped bomber untouched, trailing only thin contrails as they disappeared toward their base. Inside the B-17, the crew continued scanning, unsure if withdrawal was genuine. Combat taught men not to trust a quiet sky. Yet after several long, tense minutes, it became clear the Japanese attack was over. The bomber remained sovereign in the air, unbroken, unmarred, and guarded by nothing more than disciplined gunners and a coat of improvised paint. The transformation settled on the crew slowly. They had just experienced one of the rarest moments in aerial warfare, when ingenuity outweighed firepower, when perception shifted the balance of survival. Even DeWitt, a man grounded in practicality, allowed a moment of reflection as he studied the stripes to the cockpit windows. The pattern, crude and uneven in places, had become something far larger than an experiment. It had become a force multiplier. Below them, the Pacific stretched endlessly, glinting like hammered metal beneath the sun. That vastness carried its own symbolism. It reminded them how thin the line was between survival and disappearance, how a single idea could mean the difference between returning home and vanishing without a trace. For the Japanese pilots who retreated, the lesson was equally profound, though burdened with frustration. They had faced American innovation before, new tactics, new formations, new machines, but rarely had something so simple shifted the terms of battle so sharply. In their post-flight reports, they attempted to explain the difficulty. Some referenced unusual reflections. Others noted distorted depth. A few wrote candidly of inconsistent perception. None used the word fear. Discipline forbade it. But the undertone was unmistakable. Their certainty had been shaken. The B-17 pressed onward, engines humming, crew alert, the tiger stripe illusion still shimmering faintly along its skin. And as the aircraft moved deeper into friendly airspace, the men aboard understood that survival was not always a product of strength or firepower. Sometimes, survival came from the ability to confuse the enemy long enough to endure. The stripes, once mocked, now stood as a quiet reminder that creativity, even the rough, improvised kind born from necessity, could bend the trajectory of battle. The morning haze over the Pacific began to lift, revealing a horizon that seemed endless, a canvas of blue stretching as far as the eye could see. For the crew of the B-17, each sunrise brought both hope and dread, a paradox of the air war that defined the skies above the Solomons. The Japanese pilots, stationed on nearby islands, had grown accustomed to the patterns of American bombers, predictable, methodical, and they believed ultimately vulnerable. But this bomber was different. Its tiger-striped fuselage, bold and brash against the soft gray of the Pacific dawn, caught more than the light. It caught the imagination of those who glimpsed it from a distance. Reports from intercepted communications later confirmed their reaction: amusement, disbelief, even scorn. They spoke of it in terse, almost incredulous phrases. "What madness is this?" A Japanese squadron leader noted in his log as he watched the aircraft streak across the water. A painted beast, yet somehow untouchable. The irony was profound. Where the stripes were intended as morale-boosting individuality, they became, in the eyes of the enemy, a mark of invincibility. The history behind this peculiar choice was as human as it was tactical. The aircraft had been given to Sergeant Kenneth Ken Williams, a mechanic with a penchant for artistry and a streak of defiance, who insisted that color and pattern could bolster not just morale, but identity. In a theater defined by anonymous steel and uniformed lines, a touch of personal expression was revolutionary. And indeed, the stripes did more than lift spirits. They altered the psychology of the combatants themselves. Mission after mission, the B-17 returned from sorties with negligible damage compared to the average bomber. Japanese gunners, trained to anticipate the rigid mechanical patterns of American bombers, found themselves off balance, their timing misjudged, their instinctive leads thrown wide. Eyewitness accounts from American crew members describe moments of eerie calm as bullets passed harmlessly through cloud and sky, as if some unseen shield had taken form. It was not magic, of course, but the sum of human innovation, skill, and the unpredictability of a spirited crew. Below, on the islands where Japanese intelligence reported sightings, pilots scratched notes in fatigue-stained journals. They wrote of frustration, of losing a sense of mastery over the skies. Tactical manuals that had once been sacred texts now seemed insufficient. Each successful return of Williams B-17 sent ripples of disbelief through the ranks, eroding confidence and inspiring whispered tales of the ghost plane, untouchable and mocking. Meanwhile, for the Americans, the tiger stripes became a symbol of more than survival. They embodied ingenuity and morale in a way that transcended mere decoration. The bold orange and black lines reminded crews of home, of liberty, of personal choice amid a war that sought to strip both. It became customary for other mechanics to add subtle insignia or marks of individuality to their planes, though none matched the audacity or psychological impact of Williams' creation. The bomber's legend grew not merely because of its mechanical resilience, but because it transformed the theater of war into a stage of human storytelling. The stripes were a signal that even the most structured and lethal environment, creativity, courage, and individuality could redefine the rules. Japanese pilots, initially scornful, began to approach engagements with a mix of hesitation and respect, a psychological edge that Williams and his crew had never sought, but had earned through daring and determination. Symbolically, the stripes became a recurring motif in the reports, a reminder that abundance and freedom were not merely abstract ideals. They were tangible, visible, and manifest in the boldness to defy convention. Where the Axis saw an anomaly, the Americans saw ingenuity. Where they perceived vulnerability, Americans demonstrated resilience. Each mission, each narrow escape, reinforced a lesson. In war as in life, courage paired with creativity often outweighs brute force. By mid-1943, when air operations over the Pacific intensified, the story of the Strike B-17 reached higher command. Strategic briefings noted not only the bomber's survival record, but its psychological impact. Japanese air squadrons had begun to adjust formations, yet the plane retained its mystique. Pilots described the sighting of the stripes as a moment of pause, a second to recalibrate instinct and expectation. And so, the aircraft became a symbol of the asymmetrical nature of aerial warfare, that human ingenuity, morale, and individuality could bend even the rigid mechanics of combat to their favor. Each bombing run, each evasive maneuver, and each safe return to base reinforced an emergent truth. The tiger stripes were more than paint. They were a statement, a visual emblem of liberty, courage, and the quiet defiance that fueled the Allied war effort. For Sergeant Williams and his crew, it was never about the fame or legend that would later be recorded in archives. It was about survival, identity, and the unspoken bond that connected man and machine in the crucible of war. The Japanese pilots, in contrast, carried their own transformation, often unwittingly. Where they had expected predictability and dominance, they found chaos and audacity, calculated and precise. This shift in perception mattered as much as any physical damage inflicted. The Tiger Stripe B-17 had reshaped expectations, challenged doctrine, and reminded the world that warfare was not merely a contest of steel and fire, but of minds and hearts. The Pacific skies grew hotter as 1943 edged into the summer months. Each sortie demanded precision, nerve, and the quiet fortitude that only long months of combat could instill. For the crew of the Tiger Stripe B-17, the missions had become a rhythm, a tense choreography of survival and defiance. Radar blips and distant anti-aircraft fire were now familiar companions, yet nothing could fully prepare them for the relentless scrutiny of Japanese fighter squadrons determined to make an example of this painted anomaly. Japanese intelligence, increasingly obsessed with the bomber, circulated sketches and reports of its stripes among frontline pilots. They analyzed its every known tactic, from altitude adjustments to formation patterns, attempting to strip the Americans of the advantage they had unwittingly created. Diaries recovered from Imperial pilots note phrases such as, "The striped bomber moves as though it anticipates our attacks, and it cannot be touched, yet it mocks our efforts." These words capture a rare admission, respect born from the convergence of human ingenuity and technological prowess. On the American side, the Tiger Stripe B-17 had become emblematic of what a well-coordinated crew could accomplish. The aircraft was never just a plane. It was an extension of the men aboard, a partner in a deadly dance with fate. Each mission added layers to its legend. Enemy fighters would close in, strafing and firing with calculated intensity. Yet the B-17's formation, combined with defensive gunners' precision and Williams' meticulous maintenance, rendered many attacks ineffective. Ammunition expended by Japanese pilots often missed or detonated harmlessly nearby, a testament to the careful synchronization of human skill and mechanical endurance. The symbolism of the stripes deepened with every flight. They were more than paint. They represented abundance in a theater where scarcity defined life. For the Japanese, the bomber's appearance was a visual jolt. Here was an enemy not just surviving, but expressing individuality, resourcefulness, and, above all, unbroken morale. The stripes were an unspoken challenge, a visual testament that Americans retained the freedom to innovate, even amid relentless conflict. Historical records indicate that these repeated survivals influenced tactical doctrine. Commanders noted that Japanese pilots hesitated, even momentarily, before engaging the Tiger Stripe bomber. In aerial warfare, hesitation can mean disaster. By exploiting that slight psychological advantage, Williams' crew could maneuver into safer positions, maximizing bombing effectiveness while minimizing exposure to fire. In this way, the stripes, seemingly superficial, had tangible, measurable impact on the battlefield. The legend of the bomber spread among Allied crews as well. Letters home, written by men who had witnessed its daring sorties, described it in reverent tones. "We flew with the Tiger today," one memo read, and it felt as though the plane had a soul, a spirit no enemy could touch. Such sentiment, though anecdotal, reflects the broader morale boost provided by active ingenuity in war. The stripes reminded soldiers that even in the face of overwhelming odds, human creativity could tip the scales, if only slightly, toward survival and victory. On one particularly harrowing mission over the Solomon Islands, the B-17 faced what would have felt lesser crews. Swarms of enemy fighters converged from multiple directions, creating a deadly vortex of fire. The pilot, navigator, and gunners executed maneuvers that became textbook examples of precision under pressure. Bullets tore through the air around them, engines roared, and the bomber shuddered, but endured. When the crew returned, the Japanese reports described shock bordering on disbelief. It emerged intact, yet every pilot that attacked it swore we had aimed true. It cannot be destroyed. This repeated defiance reshaped the mental landscape of the conflict. Japanese pilots learned to fear not just the aircraft, but the men aboard, the ingenuity they represented, and the unpredictability they embodied. Conversely, American crews internalized a lesson of their own. Morale, individuality, and resourcefulness were as critical to victory as bombs or bullets. Each mission reinforced the subtle interplay between human spirit and mechanical might, demonstrating that the true power of war lay in imagination as much as firepower. Throughout these missions, the Tiger Stripe B-17 became more than a tool. It became a symbol. Its visual audacity contrasted sharply with the uniformity of Japanese aircraft, representing not only military ingenuity but also a broader philosophy. A society capable of abundance, creativity, and freedom could project strength that transcended mere numbers or firepower. The bomber's stripes, bold and bright, were a message painted in orange and black. Resilience, resourcefulness, and liberty could not be replicated by force alone. As the Pacific Campaign progressed, the aircraft's legend only solidified. Japanese pilots, once laughing at its unconventional appearance, now approached encounters with caution, sometimes deferring engagement altogether when the bomber's presence disrupted formations or sowed confusion. Even commanders far from the front noted reports describing its uncanny survivals. Williams and his crew, however, never sought recognition. To them, the stripes were personal, practical, and ultimately a quiet assertion of humanity amidst the machinery of war. As 1943 drew toward its close, the Pacific Theater became a crucible of endurance, strategy, and sheer willpower. The Tiger Stripe B-17 had now flown dozens of sorties, each one threading the needle between life and death, between precision and chaos. Its presence in the skies was no longer a curiosity but a calculated advantage. Japanese pilots had come to recognize it, respect it, and at times dread it. The stripes, once laughed at its flamboyant eccentricity, had transformed into a symbol of untouchable resolve. During a particularly decisive mission over a bow, the bomber faced a formation of the Empire's best fighter aces. Intelligence had indicated an unusually aggressive patrol that day. Elite pilots sent to neutralize the legendary aircraft. The crew, aware of the stakes, moved with an almost ritualistic precision. Engines thrummed in unison. Gunners adjusted sights, and the pilot banked a massive plane with a grace that belied its size. Japanese accounts later described this encounter as surreal. noting that despite concentrated fire, the B-17 emerged unscathed. The psychological impact on the enemy cannot be overstated. Diaries and mission logs reveal repeated entries. The striped bomber moves with foresight. It laughs at our efforts, and most tellingly, no plane should survive such a storm, yet it does. These observations underscore profound truth. The combination of human ingenuity, morale, and disciplined execution could overcome conventional expectations. What had begun as a whimsical artistic choice now exerted tactical influence on the battlefield. For the Americans, the tiger stripes were more than practical advantage. They were a symbol of what freedom could produce. In a theater where scarcity and monotony defined life for most combatants, the painted B-17 embodied abundance, individuality, and the audacity to assert identity even amid war. It reminded crew members that they were more than instruments of destruction. They were humans, creative and resilient, capable of shaping outcomes beyond raw firepower. Mission after mission, the bomber returned. Japanese forces, initially confident, now hesitated, recalculated, and sometimes withdrew. What was once derided became feared. Strategic communications from Japanese command noted the effect on morale, admitting in terse reports that the repeated escapes undermined confidence and sowed doubt. In the calculus of war, the stripes had altered perceptions, an invisible edge that no technical manual could quantify. The symbolic resonance of the tiger stripes extended beyond the air. For Williams and his crew, it became a talisman of survival, courage, and the enduring human spirit. Each mission reinforced a lesson that creativity, initiative, and audacity could bend the rigid mechanics of warfare to one's advantage. To the Japanese pilots, it was an enigma. To Allied forces, it was a beacon, a reminder that innovation often thrives where rules and convention are least expected. The final missions of the year cemented the B-17's reputation. Bombing runs over heavily fortified targets succeeded where others faltered, not because of brute force alone, but due to the crew's ability to exploit enemy assumptions and the aircraft's remarkable survivability. Survivors' memoirs describe a near-mythical quality. We trusted it with our lives. The plane became a character of its own, fearless and steadfast. The stripes, bold against the sky, were more than decoration. They were a declaration of freedom, resilience, and ingenuity. By the end of 1943, the Tiger Stripe B-17 had transformed the psychology of aerial combat in the Pacific. Japanese pilots approached it with caution. Allied crews admired its daring, and commanders recognized its influence on both morale and operational outcomes. The aircraft's legend endured because it embodied the essence of American wartime identity, a blend of courage, creativity, and a refusal to submit to expectation. In this transformation, there is a lesson beyond tactics or survival. The stripes, a simple artistic flourish, became a metaphor for the power of human initiative within the machinery of war. They showed that even in the most structured, lethal environments, individuality and ingenuity could carve out space for success, survival, and the assertion of values larger than oneself. And as the B-17 continued to soar across the Pacific, engines droning, guns ready, and stripes vivid against the endless sky, it left behind a simple truth: freedom, audacity, and courage manifest not only in victories but in the creative assertion of identity, even under most extreme pressure.